In this video, we're going to look at an example of evaluating factorials. Specifically, you're asked to evaluate 16 factorial divided by 13 factorial without using the factorial button on your calculator. Now, of course, on your calculator, if you have a factorial button, you either hit the number that you're interested in finding the factorial of, and then the factorial button, or vice versa, depending on your calculator. Let's say you were to enter the number first. If you were using a calculator for this problem, that would mean you enter 16, then hit the factorial button, then you divide by 13, and then you again hit the factorial button. Now, of course, on your calculator that's really easy, but here you're asked to do this problem without using a calculator. The reason for asking you not to use a calculator is that in some courses, for example, if you were to take a calculus course that looks at things related to sequences and series, for instance, you might have to work with factorials symbolically. So, for example, you might have to simplify n factorial divided by n minus 2 factorial, and you wouldn't be able to use a calculator for that, so you'd have to understand how factorials work. And doing this example will help build your knowledge of that. So let's go ahead and try this out. Actually, try this problem out on your own first. So just remember that 16 factorial means 16 times all the numbers below it until you get to 1. And 13 factorial is 13 times all the integers below it until you get to 1. So what you can do is write out 16 factorial as 16 times 15 times 14 and so on. And similarly with 13 factorial, and then see what terms cancel. So go ahead, try this out, and we'll continue together once you're done. So hit the pause button, and then when you're ready, hit the play button again. So hopefully you've tried this out. Let's go ahead and work this out. We've got 16 factorial divided by 13 factorial. 16 factorial is 16 times 15 times 14 times 13 times 12 and so on, all the way until you get down to 1. Now here we're just using a dot to denote multiplication, but of course you could use parentheses. That might make it more clear. You're multiplying 16 times 15 times 14 and so on until you reach 1. Now in the denominator we've got 13 factorial, which is 13 times 12 times all the numbers below it until you reach 1. Now you'll notice that in the numerator there is a certain point where you also reach 13 factorial, because 16 factorial is 16 times 15 times 14 times 13 times all the numbers below it. So once you hit the point where you've got 13 times all the numbers below it, that is just 13 factorial, and that cancels with the denominator. So again, what we find is that the 13 factorial in the numerator cancels with the 13 factorial in the denominator, and what we end up with is simply 16 times 15 times 14, which we can now work out on a calculator, and this works out to 3,360. And now we're done the problem. Again, just to recap, what we did is we noticed that in the numerator, 16 factorial is 16 times 15 times 14 times 13 times all the numbers below it. But of course, 13 times all the numbers below it is just 13 factorial, so that cancels with the denominator. So all we're left with is the 16 times the 15 times the 14. You should now be able to see how this would help you if you had to deal with n factorial divided by n minus 2 factorial, for example, in your studies later on. What you would realize is that n factorial is just n times n minus 1 times n minus 2 times all the numbers below it. So that means n factorial is n times n minus 1 times n minus 2 factorial. So then that would cancel with the n minus 2 factorial in the denominator, and you'd be left with n times n minus 1. And that's again very similar to the example done here.